Something has just shattered the silence surrounding one of the most haunting child disappearance cases in Canadian history. Text messages. Explosive, deeply disturbing text messages that investigators have guarded like classified secrets for 7 agonizing months have now been leaked to sources embedded inside this investigation. And these aren't routine communications between two ordinary people. These are private conversations between Daniel Martell and Malehya Brooks Murray, the two adults at the center of a case that has gripped an entire nation, exchanged in the weeks and days leading up to May 2nd, 2025. The day 6-year-old Lilly Sullivan and her 4-year-old brother Jack Sullivan evaporated from existence. What these messages expose is nothing short of bone-chilling. They reveal deliberate planning. They reveal festering resentment toward 2 innocent children. They reveal a relationship buckling under catastrophic pressure. And most damningly, they reveal 2 people who identified a problem and chose the most monstrous solution imaginable. These leaked communications paint a portrait so disturbing, so calculated, so coldly deliberate that it reframes everything we thought we understood about what happened inside the house before those children vanished. And for prosecutors who have spent 7 months assembling a mountain of circumstantial evidence, these messages may be the decisive piece that finally forces their hand. The smoking gun they've been waiting for. Proof of motive. Proof of premeditation. Proof of a conscience so corroded by guilt that every private message screams what their public faces try to conceal. This changes everything. But before we tear through these messages line by devastating line, you need to understand the complete anatomy of this case. Who these children were, what was happening inside the household, and why investigators locked onto Daniel and Malehya from the very first hours of the investigation. On May 2nd, 2025, in Lansdowne Station, a quiet, tight-knit rural community tucked inside Pictou County, Nova Scotia, 2 small children disappear without a trace. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident, 2 curious kids wandering into dangerous wilderness, rapidly unraveled into something far darker, something premeditated, something orchestrated, something that investigators believe was carefully planned and then buried beneath an elaborate web of lies. 7 months later, Lilly and Jack Sullivan have never been found. Lilly was 6 years old. Everyone who knew her remembers the same things. Her infectious creativity, the way she spent entire afternoons lost in drawings and artwork, her almost instinctive desire to help the people around her. Teachers adored her. Classmates gravitated toward her warmth. She was the kind of child who made a room feel brighter simply by being in it. Jack was 4. Loud, joyful, unstoppable. He could identify construction vehicles by name before most children his age could count past 10. He had a laugh. Deep, ridiculous, contagious. The kind of laugh that still echoes in the memories of everyone who ever heard it. Months after his disappearance, people still talk about that laugh. These were not names in a police file. These were real children. Children with futures that should have stretched decades ahead of them. Lilly and Jack lived with their mother, Malehya Brooks Murray, and her partner Daniel Martell on a rural property in Lansdowne Station. This was a blended family. Daniel was not the children's biological father. Their biological father, Cody Sullivan, had lost his parental rights years earlier through court proceedings. Daniel and Malehya also had a baby daughter together, Meadow, who was approximately 1 year old at the time of the disappearance. By every account, life in that household was anything but stable. Financial devastation was the constant backdrop to daily life. Daniel worked sporadically in construction, lurching between short bursts of employment and extended stretches of zero income. Malehya worked part-time retail, barely generating enough to cover groceries. Together, they were attempting to support 5 people, 3 children, on income that was unpredictable at best and non-existent at worst. They were hemorrhaging money, drowning in debt, falling further behind on rent with every passing month. That financial desperation bred constant, vicious tension. Arguments that neighbors could hear through walls. A household perpetually on the edge. And that was only the surface. The warning signs had been accumulating for months before those children disappeared. Visible, documented, reported. And yet the system failed to move fast enough to save them. Teachers at Lilly and Jack's elementary school had been quietly alarmed for a long time. They noticed bruises on Jack's small body, bruises that appear with troubling frequency, in locations inconsistent with the normal tumbles and scrapes of childhood. They watched both children change before their eyes. Lilly, once vibrant and talkative, had become withdrawn and distant over several months. She stopped raising her hand. She stopped engaging. She retreated somewhere inside herself that no one could reach. Jack displayed anxiety and hypervigilance, behaviors that experienced educators immediately recognized as a behavioral signature of trauma. One teacher refused to look away. Approximately 3 weeks before the children vanished, she filed a formal report with Child Protective Services. She documented everything with meticulous care. The bruises on Jack's arms, the marks that looked like someone had grabbed him with force, the alarming behavioral deterioration in both children. She explicitly stated she believed these children might not be safe in their own home. Her report went into a queue. An overwhelmed, understaffed system filed it and moved on. No social worker came. No investigation was launched. No one knocked on that door before May 2nd. The failure was catastrophic and irreversible. Neighbors had heard things too. Repeated arguments erupting from the Sullivan property. Children crying. Not the ordinary frustration of kids who don't get their way, but something raw and more desperate. One neighbor recalled hearing a child's voice screaming the word "stop" over and over again, followed by sound they struggled to explain away. But like so many people confronted with uncomfortable truths about what happens behind closed doors, they told themselves it probably wasn't as bad as it sounded. They didn't want to interfere. Now they carry that silence like a wound. Daniel Martell's background provided additional context that investigators found deeply relevant. Before his relationship with Malehya, he had been involved with another woman who had a young daughter. During that relationship, concerns surfaced about how Daniel interacted with the child, described as too rough, too harsh, dangerously short on patience. There was a documented incident where he grabbed the child forcefully enough to leave visible marks. A daycare worker reported it. Child welfare investigated. No criminal charges followed and the case was closed, but the pattern was now permanently embedded in official records. Malehya's history was equally troubled. Approximately 2 years before the disappearance, she had temporarily lost custody of both Lilly and Jack. The children were removed from her care and placed with Malehya's mother for several months, while she was required to address unspecified personal issues. Court records remained sealed, but family members described concerns about her emotional stability, her capacity to meet the children's basic needs, and the adequacy of her supervision. She eventually regained custody, but people close to the family privately wondered whether she was genuinely ready. And then there were the private text messages already recovered from both phones before these new leaks. Communications that gave investigators their first window into the psychological reality of this household. Daniel had texted friends about his mounting resentment. He described Lilly and Jack as burdens he never asked for, financial anchors dragging him under. Malehya had messaged her partner about feeling trapped by motherhood, overwhelmed to the point of collapse, desperately wishing she could somehow start over. Between themselves, they exchanged messages about feeling suffocated, about seeing no way forward, about the relentless weight of obligations they no longer wanted. Two adults privately discussing the same problem. Two adults who, investigators believe, eventually arrived at the same horrifying answer. The last moment anyone outside that household can independently confirm Lilly and Jack were alive was captured on security cameras at a Dollarama store on May 1st, 2025, at precisely 2:25 in the afternoon. The footage shows the entire family. Malehya pushing a cart with baby Meadow, Daniel walking alongside her, and Lilly and Jack moving to the store the way any children would. Curious, alive, normal. They returned home around 3 or 4 in the afternoon. After that, only Daniel and Malehya claimed to have seen them. What followed was approximately 18 to 19 hours with zero independent verification that those children were breathing. 18 hours where the entire world had no choice but to take two suspects at their word. At 10:01 in the morning on May 2nd, 2025, a 911 call came in from Malehya Brooks Murray. Her 2 children were missing. The story she told the operator was surface-level plausible. Lilly and Jack had asked to go outside and play in the backyard that morning. The spring weather was finally warm enough to enjoy. She and Daniel had stayed inside with baby Meadow. They could hear the children through open windows. Laughter, movement, the reassuring sounds of kids being kids. But then the sound stopped. That particular silence that every parent instinctively recognizes as wrong. When they went outside to check, the children were gone. The back gate leading into the surrounding wilderness was standing wide open. Within an hour, emergency response teams were mobilizing across Pictou County on a scale rarely seen in Nova Scotia's history. Over 100 volunteers flooded the dense woodland surrounding the property. Trained search dogs worked through rough terrain. Helicopters carved grid patterns overhead with thermal imaging cameras scanning every inch of forest floor. Drones swept the landscape systematically. Every resource available in the region was immediately deployed in the search for two small children, who everyone assumed had simply wandered somewhere they shouldn't have. And Malehya and Daniel played their roles with devastating precision. They appeared before cameras looking utterly destroyed. Malehya could barely force words through her tears. Daniel stood rigid beside her, jaw clenched, the picture of a man barely holding himself together at the seams. They released home videos. Lilly laughing on swings, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sun, Jack sprinting across the yard with that enormous laugh rolling out him like thunder. They made emotional, desperate public appeals. They cooperated with police. They participated in searches. They did every single thing that grief-stricken parents of missing children are supposed to do. The community wrapped around them completely. Vigils drew hundreds. Social media erupted with shared prayers and desperate hopes for a miracle. An entire nation held its breath. But while the public saw devastation, investigators were doing something entirely different. They were watching, listening, cataloging every word chosen and every word avoided, measuring what was said against what wasn't. Because in missing children cases, the investigation always begins at home. You eliminate the family first. And the more investigators examined Daniel and Malehya, the more the story began to fracture. The timeline was the first thing that collapsed under pressure. According to their account, the children had been kept home from school because Lilly had a cough, not just on May 2nd, but May 1st as well. And April 30th was already a day off. 3 consecutive days where Lilly and Jack were completely invisible to teachers, to school staff, to every mandatory reporter whose job it was to notice when something was wrong. Teachers later told investigators that Lilly's cough was minor, nothing remotely serious enough to justify keeping a child home for multiple days, let alone 2 children. So, why were Daniel and Malehya so determined to keep those children out of school during those final days? Investigators reached a conclusion that is as straightforward as it is sickening. They were being deliberately isolated. Kept away from the eyes of people trained to notice injuries. Kept away from the adults who had already been asking uncomfortable questions about bruises. Daniel's grandmother, Janie McKenzie, who lived in a separate structure on the same property, told investigators she believed she heard children playing on the swings on the morning of May 2nd around 9 a.m. It sounded like proof of life until investigators pressed deeper. She had never actually seen the children. She was in bed. She heard sound from outside and assumed. She never once looked out a window to visually confirm it was Lilly and Jack. She heard what she wanted to hear, or what someone needed her to hear. When investigators separately questioned Daniel and Malehya about the details of that final evening, what the children ate, who prepared it, what they wore to bed, what time their routines began, what the last words exchanged were, the answers kept shifting. Times migrated. Activities became vague and slippery. Details that should have been seared permanently into memory of any parent changed between interviews conducted hours or days apart. The truth stays consistent. Lies have to be constantly managed and remembered, and that management always leaves cracks. Then came Daniel's movements on the night of May 1st. Security footage from a gas station 30 kilometers from the Sullivan property captured a vehicle matching Daniel's truck at 11:47 p.m. Forensic video analysts determined there was better than an 80% probability it was Daniel's truck, and Daniel himself behind the wheel. When investigators initially asked Daniel about his movements that night, he stated categorically that he had been home all evening. He never left. When confronted directly with the footage, his story collapsed and reformed almost instantly. He claimed he must have forgotten. He'd probably gone out for gas or cigarettes. It had slipped his mind. You do not forget leaving your house at midnight on the last night your children were seen alive. That is not the kind of detail that evaporates under stress. That is the kind of detail that gets buried under a lie. Financial records obtained through court orders revealed something equally alarming. Over $2,000 had been withdrawn in cash from Malehya's bank account across the final 2 weeks before the disappearance. Neither Daniel nor Malehya could offer any coherent explanation for where that money went. Cash purchases leave no digital trail, no receipts, no records, no accountability. The question investigators kept returning to was devastatingly simple. What does someone need to buy with untraceable cash in the days before 2 children disappear? And then there was the internet search history. Someone inside that household, in the 72 hours before May 2nd, had researched how long children can survive exposure to cold weather conditions. Someone had researched how police conduct missing persons investigations. Someone had researched what forensic evidence investigators look for at crime scenes, and how to avoid leaving traces that can be detected. This wasn't passive true crime consumption. This was targeted, deliberate, operational research. Someone was preparing. Someone was planning. And someone was trying to learn how not to get caught. The physical evidence that investigators uncovered inside and around that property removed any remaining possibility of coincidence. Cadaver dogs brought on the grounds on multiple occasions displayed interest behavior at several specific locations. Not the full train alert that definitively signals a confirmed presence of human remains, but the unmistakable behavior response of animals detecting something biological and significant beneath the surface. Forensic samples were collected from every location that triggered a reaction. The complete laboratory results have not been made fully public, but the investigation has remained ferociously focused on Daniel and Malehya rather than pursuing any theory involving an unknown external suspect. Cell phone tower data placed Daniel's phone deep in remote woodlands several kilometers from the Sullivan property at 5:30 in the morning on May 2nd. The same approximate time and location where a delivery driver reported seeing a truck matching Daniel's vehicle description parked on an isolated service road. When pressed to explain why his phone was pinging towers in a remote forest before sunrise on the morning his children were reported missing, Daniel produced nothing credible. He thought he might have been driving around because he couldn't sleep. He couldn't specifically remember going to that particular wooded area. 2 unexplainable appearances in 2 different locations on the same critical night and morning, and Daniel couldn't account for either of them. Forensic examination of the house using luminol, the chemical compound that reveals blood invisible to the naked eye, produced results that dismantled the official story completely. In Jack's bedroom, luminol illuminated blood on the floor near his bed. In the bathroom, blood traces appeared across multiple surfaces. The floor near the bathtub, the wall. DNA testing matched both samples to the children, confirmed through comparison with their toothbrushes. Both Lilly and Jack had bled inside that house, not in the wilderness, not beyond some gate left carelessly open, inside their home. That single piece of evidence directly contradicted everything Daniel and Malehya had told investigators about 2 children who simply stepped outside one morning and wandered away. Soil analysis conducted at 3 specific locations on the property detected chemical markers entirely consistent with human decomposition, elevated nitrogen compounds, measurable changes in soil pH, the precise biological signatures produced when a body breaks down. These markers don't appear randomly. They appear in locations where decomposition has actually occurred. The forensic interpretation was grim and unambiguous. Bodies have been placed in those locations temporarily before being moved elsewhere for more permanent disposal. Every piece of evidence converged on the same 2 people. Every forensic thread led back to Daniel and Malehya. And yet for 7 months, prosecutors held back. Without recovered bodies, without confessions, without an eyewitness to crime itself, the threshold for charges, the prosecutorial certainty of conviction beyond reasonable doubt, remained just out of reach. The case existed in a brutal limbo, overwhelming suspicion, devastating circumstantial evidence, but not quite enough to guarantee justice in courtroom. Until now, because what these leaked text messages provide is precisely what was missing from an already powerful case: direct, explicit, unambiguous evidence of motive, of planning, of consciousness of guilt, and a systematic coordinated deception between two suspects determined to escape accountability for what they did. Let's start with April 3rd, a full month before the disappearance. Daniel texted a friend that living with someone else's children was harder than he'd anticipated, that they weren't biologically his, and he didn't feel he should have to support them. Not the sentiment of a man who had embraced a parental role. The sentiment of a man who viewed two children as unwanted obligations. When his friend suggested he talk to Malehya about the situation, Daniel's response landed like a stone. He wrote that talking would accomplish nothing, because the kids weren't going anywhere unless something happened to them. Unless something happened to them. 1 month before Lilly and Jack disappeared forever, Daniel Martell was already mentally inhabiting a world where something happened to them. He could rationalize it as frustration speaking, stress venting itself. People say things they don't mean. But place that statement beside what happened 30 days later, and it stops being frustration. It becomes a preview. On April 8th, Malehya messaged Daniel at work telling him Jack was being difficult and she couldn't handle him. Daniel's response was to tell her she needed to be tougher with a 4-year-old child. Not patient, not supportive. Tougher. A word with implications that become darker the longer you sit with them. On April 12th, Malehya sent Daniel a message that exposed the raw, rotting core of her state of mind. She wrote that she never understood how hard having children would be, that she felt she had made a mistake, that she couldn't continue this way, that she wished she could simply start over, without these responsibilities. A mother, writing to her partner, about wishing her children had never entered her life. Daniel's response was not reassurance. It was not a suggestion to seek help or counseling or support. His response was agreement. He wrote back that he understood completely that those children made everything harder, and that they would both be better off without them. Two adults, in private, agreeing that their lives would be fundamentally improved by the absence of two small children. On April 24th, the conversation darkened further still. Malehya told Daniel she fantasized sometimes about simply not having the children anymore, and asked him if that made her a terrible person. Daniel's response was chilling in its casual reassurance. He told her lots of people had those thoughts, that it didn't make her bad, that it made her human. He normalized a fantasy of his partner's children ceasing to exist. And 4 days later, those children were gone. Soil analysis conducted at 3 specific locations on the property detected chemical markers entirely consistent with human decomposition. Elevated nitrogen compounds, measurable changes in soil pH, the precise biological signatures produced when a body breaks down. These markers don't appear randomly. They appear in locations where decomposition has actually occurred. The forensic interpretation was grim and unambiguous. Bodies have been placed in those locations temporarily before being moved elsewhere for more permanent disposal. Every piece of evidence converged on the same 2 people. Every forensic thread led back to Daniel and Malehya. And yet for 7 months, prosecutors held back. Without recovered bodies, without confessions, without an eyewitness to crime itself, the threshold for charges, the prosecutorial certainty of conviction beyond reasonable doubt, remained just out of reach. The case existed in a brutal limbo, overwhelming suspicion, devastating circumstantial evidence, but not quite enough to guarantee justice in a courtroom. Until now, because what these leaked text messages provide is precisely what was missing from an already powerful case. Direct, explicit, unambiguous evidence of motive, of planning, of consciousness of guilt, and a systematic coordinated deception between 2 suspects determined to escape accountability for what they did. Let's start with April 3rd, a full month before the disappearance. Daniel texted a friend that living with someone else's children was harder than he'd anticipated, that they weren't biologically his, and he didn't feel he should have to support them. Not the sentiment of a man who had embraced a parental role. The sentiment of a man who viewed 2 children as unwanted obligations. When his friend suggested he talk to Malehya about the situation, Daniel's response landed like a stone. He wrote that talking would accomplish nothing, because the kids weren't going anywhere unless something happened to them. Unless something happened to them. 1 month before Lilly and Jack disappeared forever, Daniel Martell was already mentally inhabiting a world where something happened to them. He could rationalize it as frustration speaking, stress venting itself. People say things they don't mean. But place that statement beside what happened 30 days later, and it stops being frustration. It becomes a preview. On April 8th, Malehya messaged Daniel at work telling him Jack was being difficult and she couldn't handle him. Daniel's response was to tell her she needed to be tougher with a 4-year-old child. Not patient, not supportive. Tougher. A word with implications that become darker the longer you sit with them. On April 12th, Malehya sent Daniel a message that exposed the raw, rotting core of her state of mind. She wrote that she never understood how hard having children would be, that she felt she had made a mistake, that she couldn't continue this way, that she wished she could simply start over. Without these responsibilities, a mother writing to her partner about wishing her children had never entered her life. Daniel's response was not reassurance. It was not a suggestion to seek help or counseling or support. His response was agreement. He wrote back that he understood completely, that those children made everything harder, and that they would both be better off without them. Two adults, in private, agreeing that their lives would be fundamentally improved by the absence of two small children. On April 24th, the conversation darkened further still. Malehya told Daniel she fantasized sometimes about simply not having the children anymore, and asked him if that made her a terrible person. Daniel's response was chilling in its casual reassurance. He told her lots of people had those thoughts, that it didn't make her bad, that it made her human. He normalized the fantasy of his partner's children ceasing to exist, and 4 days later, those children were gone. The text messages from the final days before May 2nd read like a countdown, a methodical, calculated countdown that investigators believe represents the final stages of planning before two children were permanently silenced. Every exchange, every carefully worded message, every suspicious gap in communication tells a story that the official narrative was desperately trying to bury. On April 29th, 3 days before the disappearance, Daniel made large cash withdrawals from Malehya's bank account. Over $800 extracted in a single day. When Malehya texted asking what he needed all that cash for, Daniel's response stopped investigators cold. He wrote that there were things he needed to take care of, that it was better if she didn't know right now, that she should trust him. Better if she didn't know. Either Daniel was operating alone in whatever he was preparing, or Malehya knew exactly what that money was for, and the exchange was nothing more than theatrical distance, a performance of ignorance carefully staged for phones that both of them understood might one day be seized as evidence. Either interpretation is devastating. One reveals a man preparing something terrible in deliberate isolation. The other reveals two people sophisticated enough to construct plausible deniability inside their own private communications. On April 30th, 2 days before the disappearance, the messages about keeping the children home from school began. Malehya texted Daniel asking whether they should keep them home the following day, noting that Lilly's cough wasn't particularly bad. Daniel's response was immediate and unequivocal. Keep them home, better safe than sorry. The following morning, May 1st, the same conversation repeated almost word for word. Keep them home again. They'll be fine missing a few days. Teachers would later confirm to investigators that Lilly's cough was genuinely minor, not the kind of illness that keeps a child home for a single day, let alone 3 consecutive ones. The children weren't being kept home because they were sick. They were being kept home because the 2 adults in that house needed them invisible, away from teachers, away from mandatory reporters, away from anyone whose professional training might cause them to look too closely at whatever was happening inside those walls during those final hours. Then came May 1st, the last day Lilly and Jack Sullivan were confirmed alive by anyone outside the household. The text messages throughout that afternoon and evening tell a story that diverges sharply and irreversibly from what Daniel and Malehya would later tell police. At 7:15 in the evening, Malehya texted Daniel, who had stepped out, to tell him the kids were already in bed. Daniel responded that it seemed early. Malehya explained they were tired. Read that exchange carefully, because in their formal statements to investigators, both Daniel and Malehya placed the children's bedtime at 9 or 9:30 that night. But this text message time-stamped and preserved on a seized device, shows Malehya telling her partner the children were in bed at 7:15, more than 2 hours earlier than the timeline they presented to police. Why would two people lie about what time their children went to bed on the last night they were seen alive? There's only one answer that makes sense. Something happened between 7:15 and the time they claimed the children were still awake and active, something they needed to erase from the official timeline, something that a 2-hour discrepancy was specifically designed to conceal. At 11:02 that night, Daniel texted Malehya that he was going out for a while and she shouldn't wait up. This aligns precisely with the security footage placing his truck at a gas station 30 kilometers away at 11:47 p.m. The same trip he initially denied entirely. The same trip he later claimed he had simply forgotten about. At 5:30 the following morning, cell tower data confirmed his phone was active deep in remote woodlands several kilometers from home, the same location where a delivery driver spotted a truck matching his description parked on an isolated service road before dawn. A man who couldn't remember leaving his house, who couldn't explain why he was in a remote forest before sunrise. On the morning his children were reported missing, and then the 911 call came, and the cameras rolled, and the tears flowed, and the world believed them. But investigators never did. Because beginning on May 3rd, just one day after Lilly and Jack were reported missing, the text messages between Daniel and Malehya transformed completely. The communications of two terrified parents desperately hoping for their children's safe return gave way to something else entirely. Something clinical. Something rehearsed. Something that exposed everything. Daniel texted Malehya directly. Remember, they were both inside with Meadow when the children went outside to play. They heard them but didn't see them go through the gate. Malehya's response was equally revealing. She told him she knew what happened and remembered it perfectly. But she added something that prosecutors will almost certainly read aloud to a jury. She wrote that this only worked if they told the same story. This only works if we tell the same story. Innocent parents searching desperately for missing children do not send each other messages about making sure their accounts align. Innocent people do not need to rehearse the truth. They simply tell it. Guilty people coordinate lies. Guilty people rehearse narratives. Guilty people remind each other what they're supposed to have seen and heard and done, because the actual truth is something they can never allow to surface. On May 4th, Malehya messaged Daniel that she couldn't stop thinking about the children. His response was a single, frigid instruction: don't. Stay strong. When she pressed further, asking what would happen if investigators found out, Daniel's answer carried the unmistakable weight of someone who knows exactly what there is to find out. He told her they wouldn't. Just stick to what they agreed. What they agreed. Not what happened. What they agreed. On May 9th, after cadaver dogs had swept the property, Malehya texted Daniel with visible anxiety. The dogs had been all over the yard and seemed particularly interested in several spots. Daniel's first question was not confusion or horror, or the instinctive bewilderment of innocent parents wondering why search dogs were reacting to their garden. His first question was whether the dogs had dug anywhere. When Malehya told him they had only sniffed without digging, Daniel's response was two words that revealed everything. Good. That's good. An innocent man does not feel relief that search dogs didn't excavate his yard. An innocent man doesn't know what they might have found if they had. The text messages from the weeks and months that followed painted an increasingly fractured picture of two people straining beneath the unbearable psychological weight of what they had done. On May 12th, with Malehya having left the area to stay with family, the carefully maintained united front began visibly cracking. She messaged Daniel that she was breaking down completely, that the nightmares wouldn't stop, that she couldn't continue living inside this. Daniel's response was cold and operational. She needed to pull herself together because falling apart helped no one. But then Malehya wrote something that shattered any remaining pretense between them. She told him this was his fault, that he had promised to handle everything, that they were both going to get caught because of him. Daniel's rebuttal was immediate and devastating in its implications. He told her flatly that nothing was his fault, and then he said the words that prosecutors believe constitute one of the most incriminating statements in this entire case. He told her she wanted this just as much as he did. Wanted what? The question answers itself. There is no innocent interpretation of that exchange. There is no benign reading of a man telling a woman, in the context of missing children, coordinated lies, cadaver dogs, and nightmares that won't stop, that she wanted this just as much as he did. This is two people assigning blame for something they did together. Something terrible. Something irreversible. On May 15th, after Malehya publicly announced on social media that she was cutting ties with Daniel, he sent her a sequence of messages that removed all ambiguity about the nature of their shared secret. He told her she could block him online, but couldn't block the truth. He told her she tried to place all responsibility on him. He would tell investigators everything, including what she did. He told her directly that she did not get to walk away clean. These are not the messages of a grieving stepfather falsely accused. These are threats. Explicit, calculated threats from a man wielding knowledge of a woman's involvement in something criminal as a weapon to ensure her silence and continued cooperation. The existence of those threats confirms beyond any reasonable argument that both individuals possess guilty knowledge of a serious crime, and that each holds information about the other's direct participation. By July 8th, the psychological deterioration in Malehya's messages had become impossible to ignore. She told Daniel she was seeing the children everywhere, in stores, in the faces of other people's kids, in every direction she turned. She wrote that she couldn't escape them. Daniel's response exposed a fundamental difference in how these two people were processing what they had done. He told her to stop thinking about it. He told her what was done was done. When she asked how he could be so emotionally detached, he told her he wasn't cold. He was practical. That thinking about it didn't change anything. Practical. While the mother of his child described seeing the ghosts of two children in every face she passed on the street. Practical. These are not the communications of parents who lost children to a wilderness they couldn't control. These are the communications of two people who know with absolute certainty what happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan, because they were the ones who made it happen. On September 10th, for months after the disappearance, Malehya sent Daniel a message late at night that may ultimately prove to be the single most significant piece of evidence in this entire case. She wrote that she couldn't sleep, that she kept thinking about what they did. What we did, not what happened, not where the children might be, not whether investigators were getting closer. What we did, a direct, explicit, first-person acknowledgement of shared action and shared responsibility. And Daniel's response was not denial. It was not confusion. It was not the reaction of an innocent man receiving an inexplicable message. His response was to tell her never to say that in a text message because someone might see it. Not, what are you talking about? Not, we didn't do anything. Just, don't put that in writing. That is consciousness of guilt distilled to its purest form. As recently as November 17th, just weeks ago, Daniel texted Malehya that they had survived 7 months without charges, and that if investigators were going to move against them, they would have done so already. He told her they were as safe as they were going to be. Just keep doing what they'd been doing.